Hello there, this is Bob Wormsley from INSYDIUM.
And I'm Mike Batchelor.
And today is a very exciting day for this special edition of INSYDIUM Live because the new INSYDIUM Fused update is here.
Yes.
I hope you've all got it already. So we're going to be spending the next hour or so taking you through some of the amazing new features, new parameters, the updates in all of these INSYDIUM tools that we hope you're going to get pretty excited about because there is some awesome new functionality that we're going to be looking at. So before we actually introduce exactly what we're going to be doing, also we're going to say hi and do a bit of a round robin around the chat and see how many of you are with us. Before we do that, let's have a look at the brand new INSYDIUM Reel. Pretty cool stuff. That's the new INSYDIUM Reel. And obviously our artists have used all of the new INSYDIUM Fused toolkit to create those pretty stunning renders. As usual, John Bosley from INSYDIUM is going to be moderating and he's on the chat with you, so do say hi. He's there to help us out. He'll answer any of your questions, and of course we'll answer questions as and when we can as we go along. So let's just have a look in the chat and say hi. I've got loads of people with us. Great to have you all here. We really do appreciate you joining us and keeping us company on this live stream. So we've got so many people with us. We've got Eloise, hello. We've got New Flavor, Polychrom, Ridgie, hey Ridgie, Martin is in the house. We've got Greg with us. We've got Michael. Hello, Mike. I can never say Michael's surname. Are you going to have a go, Mike?
No.
And we have got Karsten, we have got Andre. I did a little bit of a straw poll of the locations of people on the stream, and literally we are worldwide. We've got people in Korea, we've got people in Singapore, in LA, in Europe, in Asia, all over the place. So hello to you all. Thanks for being with us, and we will get cracking. So of course, if you've been following our sneak peeks, there have been loads of updates to the tools within the INSYDIUM Fused collection. We're going to be going through loads of these new features for things like for MeshTools, for Terraform FX, for Taiao, X-Particles, and NeXus. And first of all, we're going to jump in and, actually, let me just tell you, later on, we are going to be doing, I want to demonstrate this because I'm very pleased with this new rig that I've literally just finished and I want to share it with you. And the good thing about this rig is that it uses an awful lot of the new NeXus tools. So if we just have a look into my cinema, this is actually a cached scene, but we're going to do a tech breakdown and build this up from scratch. But what we have got is this really cool variable viscosity sim where we've got this hot liquid which then cools down and it hits our wolf head and it becomes much more sticky, and then it gets melted once the hot liquid kind of pours down on it again. And we get this really cool kind of gloopy variable viscosity sim going on. So we'll do a tech breakdown of that a little later. I must share with you, Mike, before you kick off. I showed that to my wife last night and she looked at it and said, "Why are you pouring blue liquid on a wolf head?" But then I showed it to my 6-year-old son and he just went, Whoa, cool. Which was the correct
That's
response.
the right answer.
That was the correct response. Right, but let's crack on. We're going to, first of all, jump into Mike's Cinema 4D now. And Mike, you're going to be looking at some of the amazing new stuff that is in Nexus.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at primarily the questions, and what we're going to do is set up a recursion rig. So let's get started. We've got an emitter, and the emitter is just set to simulate mode in this grid box with black particles. So what we want to do is we want to get our new Nexus question, so the X particles, Nexus, NX question. And we're going to set up a few questions so we can start controlling this recursion. So the first question we want to do is we want to define it inside of a field, because when you use a field, you need to tell it that it's in a field. So first we'll add a question. And with this question, we're going to say field. So if particle data field means if the particles are inside of a field. So let's add our field. We'll add a spherical field. Let's just scale that guy down a bit and we'll lift it up. And what we're going to be doing is defining some particles with inside of this field. So back to our question in the objects tab. Now we've got that one. Before we set up an event, we want another question. So with it selected, add another question, and that becomes a child. And then with this one, once we have a question as a child, we open up these new operators. So for this guy, we're going to say and. So it's if in a field, and within particle, what we're going to choose is neighbors. So if in a field and the neighbors, and we'll set this up. So we'll say something like 40. Less than 40, so there's a distance of 10 centimeters as it's going to search for around 40 particles. And if they're less than 40, then we want to set up an action. So we'll go to our add and we'll add an action. And we'll use the set color, but for this one we want white. So enable the white. Make sure our value is full 100% because we'll need that later. Now if we go up a frame, you'll see we've define these particles just on the edges there using this new question. And I actually want a few more. So I'm going to set this neighbor search to 45. And that should just give us 2 rows of particles on this edge. That's exactly what we want. Okay, so that's the first step. The next step is we want these particles to spawn particles. And we can do that. So we'll select the top one, hold control, add another question, which now becomes a question at the bottom because this executes down. So with this one, we're going to be accessing this color information. So we do if the particle color, and then we're going to choose brightness as the vector is greater than or equal to 1. Then we want to do something, and that something we want to do is to spawn. So we'll add an action. And the action, we can choose different options here. Add, set, spawn, kill, or break. And the break is 2 break loops. So we're going to use spawn. And that says what spawn emitter. So we can just add one. And then we've got this option inherit parent. And that means it's going to inherit all the information from the first particle, its parent particle. And we don't actually want that. So we're going to turn that off so that they get their own color, speed, and scale. Okay, so if we push play, you'll see it's going to start spawning some particles. And that's a good start, but we don't want them to be moving. So we'll change the speed down to 0. And we'll change the radius down to 2 and the distance down to 1. So that's the distance from the parent and the particle radius. So if we push play now, they're just going to sit there and spawn particles. So now we want to give them some, we want them to push apart. So we can do that with the push apart modifier. So go to Nexus, Nexus push, and we're going to set this one to particle radius, and we'll set the strength to 100. So if we push play now, you're going to see it's going to start recursing and building these little growth systems, which is already looking pretty cool. Let's change a few options in the spawning emitter. We'll go to display. We'll set them to circles filled, and we'll give them a gradient parameter. We'll keep it at age because that's fine for this, and we'll just load a preset. I quite like this heat one. So with that heat there, if we go back and push play, you'll see the first particles born are this blue color. We actually want these first particles to be white so that the white particles on our question go back and feed this as a loop. So we'll go back in here and we'll move this knot up one, and then just make these ones white as well, with making sure that value is 100%. So the first spawn particles will be white, and then they'll just keep recursion over and over and over themselves. Now, one cool side effect with this, if you're not wanting this kind of blobby look, if you drop the push below the question so it executes after, let's see what happens. You start getting a completely different type of system, more tendrily looking recursive, which is quite cool as well. Not what we want for this one. So we'll put that back. And what we want to do is we're actually going to want to drive this with a vector field. So we can do that just using a turbulence modifier. So we'll go in and we'll add a NeXus turbulence. And for this, we'll use a curl. We'll put the strength down to 1. So don't need it too strong. Just want this place for these to grow into. We'll set the scale. Let's go for 250. We don't want any frequency because we don't want them to move. We just want them to follow the field. Okay, and then because we're affecting everything here with this turbulence, we can use the new mapping and we'll set color brightness to the strength so that anything that's black, they'll get no effect, because this map says anything down this end is going to be not affected by the strength of the color using the color brightness. So black particles, no strength, white particles get full strength. So let's push play. And now you can start seeing we're getting these really nice curling growth systems. And one more thing I'd like to do before this is finished is actually have some of these particles to stop moving. So we can do that again back in the questions. What we'll do is we'll select this one, hold control, add another question so it's down at the bottom. And for this one, we're going to do particles traveled. And with the condition, we can set a range. So if we say within, so let's say they've moved anything between 50 and 150. Let's do something to those particles within that range. And what we'll do is we'll set another action, and this one will set the speed. Just set the speed down to 0 so that they stop moving. And there's a bit of dampening which will help sort of slow them down as well, which is nice. So let's push play. So it's recursing, it's growing, but then after a while, some of these particles are going to stop moving because they've hit their maximum distance. But while they've stopped, like if you watch these ones, they'll stop moving. The recursion keeps happening and it keeps growing because there's the recursion happening with the white particles over and over and over. It keeps spawning and growing. And the nice thing is this is fully interactive with the field. You can move it down your geometry and keep growing it from different parts like so. So really nice, really interactive, recursive rig using the new NeXus question system.
Very cool. Very cool indeed. We just had a question actually, and I meant to say this at the beginning, asking what machine specs are we using to do these streams. So mine is the more powerful of the two PCs, but they're by no means high end. Mine is an 8-core i9 processor, and the graphics card is a 3080 Ti, so a pretty decent graphics card, but by no means the highest spec. And Mike, yours is
a 99 on a 2080, so
2080,
a fairly old card, but you can see this is all done on the GPU. This question system's running GPU code, and it's nice, interactive. I'm getting this really cool effect, and it's nice and snappy to work with.
Sure. Cool. Right. Let's jump into my Cinema 4D now. We're going to have a look at some of the new tools in Terraform FX. Now, I'm in a completely blank scene here, and that's because I want to start absolutely from scratch. So if I go to my INSYDIUM tab to Terraform, I could bring in a terrain like you could in the old way, but we've now got these presets, which just kind of can get you started with various different looks. I'm going to choose the valley. Now, when I bring this valley in, what you're going to see is that straight away we have a nicer look and some better shading. And that's because by default now, if we go into our terrain, we actually have this lighting options. Let me just go to my object tab. So if we go to our lighting settings, you can see that we have this lighting rig, which has a sun. We can adjust the pitch of that. One thing to note actually when you're using this is make sure you go to your options and that you have shadows selected, because this sun is casting shadows. So we can adjust the pitch, we can adjust obviously the heading, the direction of that sun. We have shadow settings, we can have like really hard midday shadows, and we've also got ambient lighting as well. If we ramp this up, we can kind of get that kind of hazy sunny day look. So let's reduce that down. So that's really cool. That's the light rig. And actually, if you make the whole terrain editable once you're kind of finished, the light rig becomes a usable separate light rig, which you can use in other scenes. So that's really cool. Okay, so in this valley scene, we've got a number of different operators laid up that give us this simple valley look. And we actually have this road, which is along the bottom. This is nothing new. This is TF road that we always had. But this road, if we switch it off, it is referencing this spline, and it's actually the TF path, which is referencing the spline, giving us this nice flat bit that we can then generate our road geometry. I'm actually going to switch that off, and we're going to use this spline in a moment to demonstrate one of our new tools. But for now, I'll just switch it off, because we have now got a really cool new procedural river generator as part of TerraformFX. So let's go to our terrain. We'll go to our add operator, and we have, it's actually one of the filters, a tfRiver. If I bring this into our scene, we go to the properties. There are two different types of river that we can generate. We can either use a main river using what's called a settle spline, which will use any spline of your choice, or we can use the Perlin worm. So let's do that one first. We click on that, and you'll see that we get a start and we get an end point. And the start point, it puts it on the highest part of your terrain. But we can move this start point around to wherever you want. Let's put the start point maybe there, and then move our end point down to here. And what it does, it creates this live procedural river. And if I then go to create river material, and let's click off, you can see that we have created this river material on this live generated procedural river. And if we want to, we can kind of, this is remains live, so we can move this around the place wherever we want, and it will update. I'll show you some of the settings in a moment where we can change the way in which this looks, but we can also create secondary rivers from this. So with it selected, if we come down to secondary rivers, now we have got these secondary rivers in our scene, and that's looking pretty neat. And of course, the default is 5, but we can bump this up to say 8, and we can have as many as you like, really, and that will update, and it remains procedural. And we can also, if you want to, we can export this river system as splines, and then you can use them in simulations. You can get particles to follow them, for example, and that is really quick and easy. Just export rivers, and let me lift those up. And there, look, we have our river splines exported, should we need those for any kind of, I don't know, any kind of scene that you may
And that is fully,
them.
that stays live as well. So if you move the river, that spline updates as well. You can also have secondary rivers linked to secondary rivers, so you can just stack them up as well if you want more and more branching. And
the fact that it remains procedural is just super cool to work with, and obviously it gives you the power of a procedural setup. Let's just get rid of that though now, because I want to show you using our spline. So let's make this spline. Remember, this was the one that we were using to make our path, and I'm just going to take our spline. I'm just going to move on the wrong tool here. Let's go to our spline, and what am I on? Brush selections, what I want. Let's click on that and move it out. I'm just going to move these endpoints out a little bit for this spline. something like this. Okay, so there is our spline. And what I want to do is go to my river now, and we're going to add a settle spline river. And in this settle spline, we need to drag in our spline. And now we have it based on this user spline, which will do it as the starting point, but then you can make adjustments to this as you go. So now look, I mean, we can make it really wide, should we wish, and that'll update. We can make it much deeper, should we wish, and then we can actually change the way in which it's flowing down our landscape. So I'm just going to hit NQ to hide those materials. And now you can see, look, our river cut away from our terrain. Let's go a bit more on the depth to make it deeper. Let's make it much wider. And then what we can do, look, let's go to our deform sections. And we can start deforming this. So it's based on our user spline that we've put in, but then we've added some deformation to the flow of that river. We can use the wiggle options to adjust that further. And then we've got kind of smoothing functions as well. Then we have altitude options. Now, by default, it's set to downhill flow, but you can actually just set it to project on the terrain based on the spline. You can reverse the flow of the river should you wish with the downhill mode. And then we've got render options, which give you further options in how the river is cut out of the terrain, including, you can see that all of this noise detail here, this isn't generated from the terrain. This is actually the river that's doing this with our edge noise. If I reduce that way down, you can see that we just have the smooth riverbed. Then we bring in the edge noise, make it stronger, and that's giving us this really nice edge to our rivers. And then we can obviously scale it up. If we scale that noise, you can see we've got a much larger noise driving that on the edge. Scale it down for much more kind of detailed, noisy edges to our river. So stuff that's kind of like eroded, like in a canyon, you could use that for. So that is just a very quick run through the really powerful tfRiver filter in Terraform FX. It's a lot of fun to use, and we can really quickly make some pretty cool river assets in your existing terrains or new ones. I'd really urge you to have a play along with that one and mess around with it. It's a lot of fun, and there's a lot of power. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to show you another Terraform FX tool, actually. Let's move into this scene. Because there is a new ray tracing tool which enables you to use scene objects, and through ray tracing technology, that scene object then gets included in the height field. So this is really good for, I would say this is really good for motion graphic style shots where you may have a logo or an object or a character that you want to be within your terrain. So here we have got our INSYDIUM rubber duck model, and we've got a basic terrain. Now you'll see that I've laid this duck down on the side. Now I've done this for a reason, because there are limitations to how ray tracing can add to the height field, and what it can't do overhanging geometry. It's kind of straight up and down. So on its side, there isn't really any overhanging geometry here, and it's going to have no problems. If this was sat upright, the beak would be overhanging and it wouldn't work for the ray tracing. But for this, it's going to work really well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go to my TF terrain, and let's just have a look. What are we on? 1500 divisions. That's great. So let's go to our TF trace, and I'm going to put my TF trace at the top. I'm going to switch off that noise. And then in the TF trace, I'm going to drag in, let's just make our duck invisible. I'm going to drag in the duck. And now you can see that it's done it. So it's kind of shot out these rays from 0 altitude straight upwards, and where it is intersected with the geometry, it has been able to use that to create this altitude data. And now we've got a mountain made out of our duck. Now, but we aren't getting smooth shading, obviously, because this isn't a rendering trick. So what we need to do is smoothen this off. So what we would do, let's just go to tfTerrain. We'll add a blur. Let's put it above the noise. The blur, we'll keep it on box blur, which is dead fast. And we'll just blur this way out, which smoothens all of those edges. Pretty cool. And now all we need to do, look, is reintroduce our noise layer. And this is on a subtraction mode. And now I'm imagining this kind of shot works really well. If you started your, whatever your logo reveal somewhere down here, you've just got this, what looks like a rugged mountainscape or a Mars landscape. And then as you move the camera up, there we have got our logo, our model, whatever that may be. And yeah, there's loads of options within tfTrace to incorporate scene objects into the height field of your terrain. And again, this is another very cool one to play around with.
And with that, you can output a vertex map just for that object, so that therefore you can render it separately from the terrain as well if you wanted to give it a different texture.
Yeah, sure. You go to tfTrace, activate vertex map, and it gives you a vertex map. All right, excellent. So that is tfTrace, a really good inclusion to Terraform FX. So yeah, do go and have a play with that one. Right, that is what is new in Terraform. Another one of the really popular tools within INSYDIUM Fused, Mike. It's one of my favorites as a kind of stylistic thing, but a utility tool is MeshTools. And that has got some really cool new options. So Mike, let's jump into your Cinema 4D now, and you're going to show us, what are you looking at?
I'm looking at spline effects for this one. Okay, so in this scene, we have a couple of objects, just a torus and a plane, and there you go. The torus has an animation tag or a vibrate tag, and you can see there's an emitters emitting these particles. So one on the torus and one on the ground, and they're just flashing on and off. Now what we want to do is we want to create a electrical arc between these particles. So we'll go to INSYDIUM, go to MeshTools, and we'll grab our new MeshTools Spline Effects. So we go into the Objects tab, and here it's saying what are the start objects and what are the end objects. So if we put emitter A, which is on the torus, as our start, emitter B as our end, and if we play, nothing's going to happen. And the reason nothing's going to happen is because the connection type by default is origin, which means the origin of an object. Well, these are particles, they're not objects, so we need to change this to points. And you can see it's starting to create these arcs. And I'll just get a couple in the scene. Okay, so let's do a bit of tidy up on these splines. So we'll go to the spline tab, and we'll increase the points, which is the amount of points along the length of the spline. And the more you have, the more detail you get. So we'll set it to 100. Go back to motion, and here you've got two options for the large noise and the small noise. If we turn the small off, you can see the large is just these bigger ones. And what we'll do is we'll increase the scale of those slightly, something like this looks good. And we'll bring in the small noise as well, just to add a little bit finer detail. And I'm going to jump to display and just change this display slightly so it looks a bit more cool and electrical. So we'll do that, and we'll make this middle arc white so it looks a bit more electric. So straight away, with a couple of clicks, we've got this arcing system. Now, what would be cool is if it looks like it's creating sparks as well as it hits the ground. So we'll do that with nxQuestions. So we'll go into X particles, nxQuestions, we'll drop in a question. And with this question, we're going to, firstly, we're going to exclude it from emitter A. So as it's basically a modifier, you just go into the modifiers, drop the question in, and it's excluded from emitter A. You can see it went back to blue. So now it only is talking to emitter B. We can add a question, and we'll just say if the particle age is greater than 0, then do something. So as soon as it's born. And what we want it to do is just to add a spawn. So we'll add an action, we'll set it to spawn, add our spawning emitter. So if we push play, it'll start doing it straight away. You can see there's a few little particles. Now we'll turn off this inherent parent so we can see them better. And we'll create more particles. leave the rest default. So push play again. There you can see we'll get some spawning. So let's just set these up. They need some gravity, so we'll drop in a NeXus gravity modifier. So we won't have so much strength. Let's just about 150, 20 variation. And in the spawning emitter, let's change it to lines. And we'll give it a gradient parameter of heat, so just sparky looking thing. Now we don't want them full life, so we'll give them, let's say, 15 frames with a 10 frame variation. Push play. You get that cool little sparks happening as it's hitting the ground. So that's looking good. Now, one more thing I thought would look quite cool is if we add some secondary forks coming off these ones. And what we want them to do is we want them to look like they're attaching to the ground, because if you add forks, they're just going to come out on their own unless you set them up to attach to something. So what we can do is we can add an object at the bottom of each of these particles so that it can attach itself to. So we'll add a sphere, and let's get an xparticles generator. So we'll generate the spheres from emitter B, and we'll set the scale to source. So if we push play, we'll see we'll have these giant spheres, and that's what we want our arcs to attach to. So we just need to do one thing. We need to put this into our XP join. So we're creating some geometry for it to look at, and we can hide that. So we'll go back to Spline FX, and we'll go to the new connections, and we'll add a fork layer. So if that's enabled, if we create some, you can see it's got these little forking parts, and you've got loads of control over these, how many, how long they are, angles, and distribution. And we'll just change the distribution slightly. So if you're familiar with Taiao at all, this will make sense because it's the same sort of system. It distributes the forks along the length of the parent, which is cool. And we'll go back and set it to 2 because we don't want too many. And the only thing we need to do now is tell it what to connect to. At the moment, it's connecting to none, but we can set that to custom object, and we can use our join. So you can see it's created these forks that are joining to the new particles that are being generated. So just push play. As you can see, we're getting these really cool sparking, forking. And if you wanted these ones to also spark, all you'd need to do is in their emitter, go to modifiers and enable that question as well. So you get sparking from here as well as down there. So you get this really cool interactive procedural lightning system with the new spline effects. And that's only one thing. It can do all sorts of cabling and all sorts of cool effects.
Sure. And also with all of these mesh tools that create and generate splines, we always say this, but the splines can be used everywhere in Cinema 4D where splines can be used.
Yeah, it's returning a proper spline object. If you made it editable, you'd just see a cinema spline.
Yeah, so you can, mesh them, you can emit from them, you can render them, you can do all that stuff.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, let's stay on mesh tools, because one of the other new tools that we've got, let's just jump into my cinema now, is MeshTools Rayline, which is another ray tracing tool like we saw in Terraform. And all of those amazing laser-like effects that you saw in the new INSYDIUM showreel obviously used this. So let's just bring one into this scene, and I'll explain what's going on. If we go to MeshTools, we can bring in MeshTools Rayline. There you are. And what this does, let's just bring it up. We have an object. You can change how it does this, but it casts these rays from the object, and then the rays will interact and collide with any scene geometry that you tell it to, and they'll bounce around, and then it generates these splines based on those rays, but it also generates contact points, which you can use in simulations and you can render. So let's just show you. We'll go to MeshTools Rayline, to the Object tab, and it needs to know what do the rays want to collide with. So let's put in our INSYDIUM Wolf. We'll put in the floor plane, and we'll put in these two just scene cubes as well. 1, 2. And then if we get our Rayline object, let's hit R, and we rotate this down, you can see that every time it bounces and interacts with an object, it bounces off and that ray shoots away. And it'll keep doing it as long as it has enough ray length. At the moment, it's limited to 500, the default. But if we just keep bringing that up, they can be as long as you like. And so we get these really cool bouncing rays. Now, these in their own right can be rendered, they can be meshed, and we can also use these points to either clone objects, but we can also use particles, which is really good. So what I'm going to do is just get rid of those two cubes. In fact, we don't need these in our scene, so I'm going to delete those out. And with my ray line, what we're going to do here, I'm going to show you the integration with NeXus and with particles. So with our ray line, what we're going to do, and you may remember this from the sneak peek, we're going to imagine that these rays are lasers and they're kind of etching and burning into our model, where we'll get some kind of burning sparks, which will use particles. So we don't actually want these bouncing around. We just want them to make contact once. And the way we do that is we just put this single shot on. And now if I just rotate that up like this, and then let's just position that so they're kind of hitting our wolf, something like that. That's going to do on its head. Right. So we're making contact with the surface of this wolf. And what I'm going to do is just keyframe this angle. The angle gives you this. So let's just start it on 0, on frame 0. Middle of the scene, we'll stick it up to maybe, 46, and then we'll have them going back. So now we have this animated lasers going, and then they hit the floor, and then they go back onto the wolf. Now, what we want to do is have a little burning point every time they go across the surface of our objects. So what we need to do is this. Let's go to, first of all, the display, and I'm going to turn off the display for all of the points because we don't need to see those. And in the, let's change this gradient to kind of default fiery laser color. That's about right, Mike?
Yeah, that works.
Fiery laser. Right, there's our lasers. So now what we want to do, let's go to the points. And what we can do is the contact points we want control over. And what we're going to do is we're going to create an emitter. So let's add an emitter. And here is our emitter. And let's just call that emitter contact. Okay, and in the display tab, I'm going to put it onto spheres just so we can see them. So now if I hit play, look, we've got a particle moving everywhere that is making contact with our wolf, which is excellent. But we don't want to view these as particles. In fact, they don't need any display. So we'll go to the display and we'll go to none. But what we want to do is we want to spawn particles from the position of those ray line ones. So look, let's use NeXus to do this. We're going to go to INSYDIUM, NeXus. Let's bring in a question. And the question, let's bring in a question. The question is going to be, if the particle is in emitter, let's do an emitter question, because this is quite a cool technique. If you've got, say, 3 emitters in your scene and you've got one question asking questions of particles, it's going to affect all of those emitters, and you might want to isolate the effects just to one. And we can do that by saying only do it if it's in this emitter. So look, let's go to emitter. So if emitter, and then we can drag in the one in question, emitter contact. So if particles are in that emitter, do something. We want to spawn. So let's bring in an action, and we want to spawn particles, and we can bring in a spawning emitter now. So let's add an emitter, and here's our spawning emitter here. Good. And at the moment, it's inheriting the parent's particle properties. But actually, let's not do that. We'll take that off. And the velocity can be on random. We'll give them a speed. So they're going to go off in a kind of a spherical direction. We'll give them a speed of 64. We'll give them a small radius, maybe 1. And we're going to set the color in the emitter itself. So if we hit play now, let's just have a look. And yes, look, we're getting spawned particles. We need some gravity in the scene. So let's go to INSYDIUM, X particles, NeXus, and we'll bring in a NeXus gravity. So now they're going to spawn. Yeah, that's good. And let's go to our emitter display option, and we're going to change them to dots. And let's give it a gradient parameter, color. We want a fiery color. Let's go, I'm going to go with, we'll leave it on age actually. I'm going to load a preset, and I've got this preset here. Okay, so this is mapped to age. So when they're born, they're white. And then as they grow out, they become black. Let's go to our question. And we've only got one being spawned. So let's up this to maybe 20. We'll give them a little bit more speed. And hit play. So now we're getting these spawn particles coming out. That's too much speed, actually. Let's put that down. We'll put the distance down to 1. And in my wolf, let's just take some of that friction off. So now anywhere where these particles go, we've got new particles being born. And obviously this is just a very simple setup to demonstrate, but this remains procedural. So look, let's put my ray line. I've got this little animated null here that's just going to give a little bit of secondary animation when they turn round. And then look, they're turning around, yeah, and they're moving up, and that's cool. But if we were to move the ray line, we can just move it anywhere. Look, and it stays procedural throughout. And now that we've set that up, we can get that to work on anything. And obviously you can make it way more complex. You can give these particles fuel and temperature and create a smoke and fire sim from their position. And it's all kind of working together as one kind of coherent set of tools.
You could even carve it out with vertex maps and displacements and all sorts of cool stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Excellent. And so that's Rayline. Itself a really powerful tool, just playing with it, making splines, but the integration with the rest of the tools is really pretty powerful. Right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a look at a couple of features which are kind of linked. One is for NeXus and one is for X particles. And they're both kind of interchangeable, really. So the first one, we're going to have a look at NX Foam. And I'm sure you've seen these from the sneak peeks, but as an artist, this is a massively helpful new feature. So in this scene, what you can see is a cached fluid sim. And I've actually done this cache with the NeXus tool. So it's using an NX fluid, it's using a rotate and a vorticity to give this really kind of noisy whirlpool. But this is cached. I can switch all of this stuff off and it still works. Now this could be an X particles fluid effects cache. It would work exactly the same. And this works with both NX foam and with X particles foam. And you can generate live foam particles from these cached fluid sims, and this makes it much easier to kind of art direct your foam. So we're going to do it with NeXus. Let's set it up. The only thing you need other than the cached emitter for foam to work, you need an active gravity object because the foam uses gravity in its buoyancy calculations. So you do need that. Well, let's go to our NeXus. We're going to go to NX foam and bring it in. And we want a new foam emitter. So we'll add an emitter. And in the foam emitter, here it is. Let's just bring it down into our emitters. And in here, when I do foam, I always like to make the display, because we're making quite a lot of foam particles, I like the display to be white dots. So let's go back to our NX foam. Now, what we're going to do, I'm going to switch. I'm not going to go through all of the settings for foam because it's quite a lot and it's quite complex, but we've got loads of foam training on our YouTube channel. And there's loads of fluid stuff that will go through this in detail. But what we're going to do, I've switched off the air rate. So we're not generating foam from particles trapping air between each other. We're just going to do them from the crests of waves. And what we're going to do is, let's just reduce this crest rate down to maybe 10. I'm going to put the life, we'll emit foam particles after 10 frames, and let's just say they're going to live for about, we'll make this a bit lower, 75. So now we've got that set up with our gravity. If we hit play, yes, we're getting foam particles. And if we go in, you can see just how much detail that brings to our sim. And this is generating this as we're playing it. It's cached, but the foam particles are live. And I mean, just it's amazing the difference a bit of foam makes to a fluid. It means that you can actually cache a much kind of lower particle count, lower quality sim. If you're adding foam to it, it's the foam that brings out the detail. If we go back to our NX foam, let's get rid of those crest ones. Let's add some air rate particles. I'll put this on maybe 20. And if we hit play here, we're not going to get any because our impact settings are too high. The thresholds are too high. There's not enough force between particles to trap the air. But if we put my min impact down to 0, max impact on maybe 4, now we're going to get that trapped air foam particles. Let's have a look. Yeah, there it comes. Excellent. Very, very cool. And this, as I say, it just makes it so much easier. You sim and cache your fluid first, then you get your foam sorted, and you can make adjustments as and when you like. So that's one, and that, as I say, that works with, so if you have an NX fluid sim that's cached and then you're somewhere else and you don't have that, you could do this with X particles foam and vice versa. If you've got a fluid effects sim that's cached, bring it in and just use NX foam and you've got the speed of the GPU. Or if you've got some old X particles sims. Let's have a look at a similar feature, and this is a new NeXus object, and this is NX upres. So in my scene here, let's just switch this turbulence off. We have simmed a low particle count simulation, which is just arrow particles with a curl turbulence. And we can see that I'm scrubbing this backwards and forwards. It's cached. So what we can do is we can upres this with a higher particle count emitter. So to do that, look, we'll get our emitter source. I can hold control, drag it down to make a copy. Let's just delete that cache tag, don't need that. And this one, we'll just change it and call it emitter destination. Okay. And on this one, we'll go to the display mode and we'll do dots. We'll put I'm going to put the color just on a single color for now. And in the emission tab, instead of it being 100 particles per second, let's put it up. We'll just put it up on 10,000 for now. So what we want to do is we want to use NX upres to take the, well, in the first instance, the velocity information from our arrows, and for that to be interpolated on our new particles. So let's go to INSYDIUM X particles NeXus. We'll go to upres, and it needs a source emitter. Let's stick in our source. It needs a destination emitter. Let's stick in our destination. And we're just going to leave it all on default for now. And what you'll see is that our pink destination particles are being moved around by the velocity information that's being read from our source particles. And that in its own right is really cool. But look at all of the different bits of data it's able to use from the cached particles. For example, we can use color as well. So if we click on color, now look, we're getting that mix of colors from our source particles. So that's pretty cool. And what it's doing is, you can see this max count amount. And what it's doing there, each particle is finding its closest 3 particles from the emitter source, and the properties are being interpolated. So the more in the max count, the higher the number, the kind of more accurate your simulation is and the smoother this interpolation may seem. But obviously there's loads more calculations going on, so it can slow it down. But now you'll see we've got a much kind of smoother motion with our upresed particles. But we can do some other things. So upresing is not just about taking old simulations and adding some more particles to them. It can actually be used as kind of an artist's tool in its own right to get effects that would be really difficult to do without it. So to demonstrate that, what we can do is start using the position as well. So if I click on position, and let's make the source particles invisible. On full strength, they're going to kind of get the position of our source particles and they're going to collapse in on each other. This in its own right is quite a cool look, but it's a little bit too severe as they're collapsing. But if we reduce the strength of the overall effect, what you're going to see is they're not going to collapse as much, and we start getting these really interesting thick kind of tendrils, which are all based on this lower particle count simulation. And if you up the particles here, you get some amazingly wispy looking effects. We can bring that down even more. And we're getting these really nice, it almost looks like a fluid sim. And remember, this is just one curl turbulence affecting, you know, about 500 particles. That's it. And this is what we're getting from it, which is really nice. And there's one more effect that is excellent. And one of the features that's been added to this is because of this almost collapsing effect that you get when you're taking the position of the original particles, we've put in a push which will push the particles apart. So if I click on this push, but then put it way down to maybe just 2%, as I've been playing with this, I've had much better results with push on a very low amount. And if we hit play, what happens is it pushes them apart and we get this really cool kind of beading, water beading effect with a high surface tension fluid. It's almost like weightlessness liquids. And if we just reduce that down a bit, we start getting this awesome beading, which I would have to think really hard about achieving that effect with other tools. But here, it's just something that I happened across whilst we were playing around with NX upres. I really, really like this tool. It's a lot of fun.
Very powerful.
Very, very powerful indeed. And we've got to keep reiterating that all of this amazing simulation is happening just from this one really basic simulation with a curl noise and some turbulence. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that one, Mike. That is excellent. Okay, so that is more of the stuff that's available. Now, in a few moments, I'm going to have a look at doing a technique breakdown for that variable viscosity fluid, and that's going to contain loads more data mapping, in case you wanted to see that being demonstrated, and loads more questions and actions. But before that, we can't move on, Mike, without talking about Taiao, which has... It's not an understatement to say it has had a massive overhaul.
It's basically a new Taiao.
Yeah.
Before we do that, I just want to... someone was asking how to do cables with spline effects, and I thought we'd show that really quickly. So it only takes a couple of minutes to show that.
Do you want me to jump into your cinema?
Yep, let's jump over.
Here we go.
I've made these basic little cylinders, and here's spline effects. So what we want to do is to do cabling is you just set up the same thing. So you want cylinder to cylinder one. That creates that connection, and then we can do cylinder 1 to cylinder 2 to create the secondary connection. Change that to points, and then you can, not points, let's do surface, and then you can have the amount that you want. All you want for cables is to turn all the motion deformation off, go to gravity and add gravity, add a bit of variation, and you've got instant cables, and it's all live. These things can animate, move around, and do whatever they want. So that's how you'd look at setting up cabling with these new SpineFX.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump into Taiao.
Yeah, go on, you fire away, Matt.
Okay, so first thing we want to look at is growth, because when we did the first preview, we showed all the how the new tools work with the modifier stacks and all that sort of stuff. So we've been over that. So we want to look at the growth and the forces, which is something we didn't look at on the previous streams. So here we've got a plant which is made up of a trunk, branch, custom object, which is the Taiao flower, and a leaf. And if we turn off the plant and look at these objects, you can see that they're both keyframed. So they've got some simple unfurling animations. Now with the leaf, for example, you can see there's a bit of intersection. Now you can change that really easily just by layering up the modifiers in the leaf object. At the moment, I'm just using one furling, but if you want no intersections, just layer up your furling and get different furling angles, and you can get really clean animated unfurling.
And that's one of the big changes is the modifier stack. In the old Taiao, you only had one furling.
You had one furling.
Now you can stack them up and up and up. And I've had a go at this, and it's dead easy.
Yeah.
The control you've got is absolutely immense.
Yeah, it's really cool. So we'll put our plant back on, and the plant now, you'll see, let's go into our plant. We'll go into the growth tab, just a couple of those for those. So the plant will have that keyframe, but it won't grow. So if we do the growth, that keyframe information isn't supported. So one of the things we've changed is every layer that you make in the plant layers gets transferred to its own individual layer as a growth layer, which means you can control the growth of every part, use fields to grow them. It's all separated, so you've got loads and loads of control. But we're still missing that keyframe. And you can note that we've got these new keyframes in our layers here. So let's enable it for the leaves, and you can see it's opened up these new options. So we've got animation control over those keyframes, and you've got three different options. You've got the growth slider, which is this growth slider here. You've got the global growth, which is the main growth slider, or you've got an animate slider, which will change this aftergrowth into its own animate slider. So we'll go back to growth slider, and we've got trigger modes. So the default is sequence, which means if we change this growth slider, you can see it's changing that growth animation in sequence from the bottom of the plant up. And what this growth slider is doing, it's doing both scale and animation. So it's animating them up the chain. Now you can use random as well if you want a random growth, or you can use a field. So let's have a look at the other options. So the global growth, if we turn that on, that's going to do the same thing, but it's going to do it with the growth of the whole plant. And let's set that back to sequence. So we can grow that whole plant, and then it triggers those leaves unfurling as it grows up, which is really cool, much more natural. Then we have the animate slider, which gives you individual control over those as well with variation, which is if you want to be doing the growth secondary and then the animate on top, you can do that as well. And with the growth slider, you have this after growth. And what that means is a percentage after this is fully grown. So let's say we want trigger the animation 50% of this growth slider. So nothing will happen. It'll scale up. Then after 50%, then it'll start triggering that growth. Okay, so that's cool. And the same for the flowers. So they're in custom objects, but they have their control as well. So you can set they're set to random, and they randomly open and close, which is really nice. So what we'll do is we'll set the leaf and the custom objects to field. We'll drop in a spherical field for now. Like so, and we'll make sure that that field is also in the flowers. So now we can drive it with a field as well. So if we scale this down, you can see it's driving that growth and the keyframes, which gives you so much more control over how you grow the Taiao plants much more naturally using these new growth animation systems, which is really cool. Okay, and then lastly, inside of Taiao, we'll have a look at the forces. So we've got this plant here, and again, it's just a trunk, branch, and a leaf. And if we go to forces, you can see that they're also in their own separate tabs, which means full control over every part of the plant using the force options. So we'll enable forces, push play. So we've got a simple force. We've got a wind strength, which is the amount of wind affecting the parts, variation to the wind, and then our turbulence options, which just give it some turbulent motion. And that's all set by default. So we'll close that down. Now we can look at the individual parts. So we'll turn the leaf off so we can just focus on the stem and the branches. So the branch, we're in the growth trunk here. So you can see we can change the strength of it. We'll have it playing while we're doing this. So you can make it stronger just on that part on alone, or if you want the branches to have loads as well. And you can also then, with the new layer weight, which is a control up the length of the parent, you can control how much of effect that wind is getting on that part. You can also control then the frequencies of both the wind and the turbulence individually per layer, which is just way more control that you had before and much more natural looking wind. So we'll just drop this back down like so, and we'll bring down the strength of the branches like that. So then if we want to look at the leaf, so let's bring our leaf back in, go to plant layers, enable our leaf, go back to forces. What we'll do is we'll turn off all of the wind on the branch and the trunk, so we can just look at the leaf. If we push play on the leaf, you can see we've got standard force. It's just rotating a leaf, which is quite natural when you're looking at a big plant, but sometimes you want a bit more control. So now you can control the strength of that and the frequency, which is good. But we also have this new option. So if we enable this, now you can see we get these new options here. So we've got a wind bend strength, which is going to bend those leaves in the direction that the wind's going. So if we go to our globals, rotate the direction, you can see that wind is bending those leaves in the direction of the wind, which is nice. And then we also have these individual curl noises. So let's turn the wind bend strength off. So we're just looking at that. So you can see what's happening is they're deforming in this nice wave motion. And that's with the curl strength and the scale. So if we drop that scale, you can see what's happening. It's like a wave. It's rippling through these leaves. You can change that up so it's a bit more natural. And you can start getting this really nice, natural looking motion out of the leaves.
And that's per leaf.
That's per leaf.
Yeah.
You've got this phase variation. So that's a different phase per leaf, and the variation, which is a variation on the scale. And again, you can change the part of the leaf that's affected by it. You can also, if you really wanted to, add secondary motion with the modifiers, because in our plant layers, let's turn this off, for example, we'll turn off forces. And the trunk has a turbulence modifier. The turbulence modifiers also have a frequency, so that means you can add secondary motion just with the turbulence modifiers, which again you can stack up. So there's just loads more control for forces and growth inside of Taiao.
Brilliant. Amazing. Yeah, I've got to say, I always enjoyed Taiao and found it quite easy, but I think the new tool set, the new layering system, the changes that have been made make it really kind of intuitive just to play around with, really, and get the stuff that you want. I must say, we have talked an awful lot about some of these new features. It almost feels like we've barely scratched the surface of the Fused update. It is massive. There's so much stuff. And Martin on the chat has reminded me, I've got to tell you, that if you need help with any of these features, the manuals are available online for all of the INSYDIUM Fused collection tools. So just go to the website, look for the manuals, and every single parameter will have a description on how it works. And the manuals have been a labor of love for our training department. They've got really nice imagery. They've got videos to demonstrate features where necessary, so you can get your head around how things are supposed to work. And they're really in depth, and they'll help you out. A great reference point. So to find them, go to the website, the INSYDIUM website. and you'll find the link to the INSYDIUM manuals. They're up now with all the new features, and they are ready to go. Right, let's move on now, and we're going to have a look at this tech breakdown now. Let's jump into my cinema. So here we are. Here we have my wolf, and this is going to be our starting scene. And what we're going to be able to do, we weren't able to do this before, but the new tool sets within NeXus means that we can do really detailed data mapping of the parameters of virtually every modifier. And that means that we can do some effects that we couldn't do before, including doing variable viscosity fluids, like getting fluids to be hot and be very liquid and get much more viscous and sticky as they cool down. So here is our scene, and we've got an emitter, and it is firing out particles and colliding with our wolf and the floor, but there's no physics going on yet. All we've got is a NeXus gravity. I'll just show you the emitter in case you're following along or you want to have a look after and have a go. We've got it in circle mode. It's 20 centimeters radius. We've got the emitter plane -y, just so it's pointing down. Then in the emission tab, we're in hex emission mode. We've got no speed, and we've got a radius of 1 centimeter. And that is giving us this particle flow. And they're being emitted just white. So what we want to do first is, the reason we're emitting them white and not doing the usual colouring tricks with fluids is that we're going to control the colour ourselves, which will control the viscosity of the fluid, control whether it's hot or cold. So what we're going to do first is get the fluids. I'm going to go to NeXus. We're going to bring in an NX fluids, and we're going to use the SPH solver. Now, it's personal preference. They've both got their strengths, but I prefer SPH, and I use it 99.99999% of the time. I love SPH. It can do liquid and it can do grains. We're going to do liquid, and I'm going to keep this really simple. Everything bog standard settings. I'm going to put the viscosity up to 100. And I'm going to put the surface tension up quite high to maybe 40. So even just with that, we're now getting more of a fluid simulation. We're not really getting a viscous fluid yet, but look, you can see the surface tension acting. It's forming these water globules. That's the surface tension doing that. So it is working. And if we go to our INSYDIUM Wolf collider tag and increase the friction, they'll start sticking a bit. And you'll see that we are kind of getting a thicker style fluid sim, but it's certainly not right yet. So now what we're going to do is, instead of going really high in the NX fluid settings to get a thicker viscosity, so instead of massively increasing the substeps for accuracy and massively increasing our viscosity iterations, we're going to leave it default, which is much quicker to process, but we're going to give them a helping hand by mixing another one of the NeXus solvers. So let's go to NeXus, and we're going to bring in a constraints. And I want, the hierarchy is important. I want the fluids to solve first, then the constraints. And the constraints, what we're going to do is we're going to add some connections between these particles, basically. I'm going to up the iterations to 3, which gives us greater accuracy, and it'll give us stiffer constraints. 3 is a good starting point for me. If you're ever doing work with constraints, I virtually always will have iterations on 3. So we're going to add a constraint. We're not using connections, which are like springs between particles. We're going to use viscosity constraints. And we're going to reduce the amount. So what we're going to say is any particle can be connected to 3 other particles with a viscosity constraint if they are within, I don't know, let's say 20 centimeters of each other. So now let's hit play, and you're going to see an immediate difference here. Look how gloopy it's become. And in fact, that on its own, for many instances, will work for your viscous fluid. If you want to do honey in a product shot, that is going to work for you. And that in its own right simulates quickly, looks really nice. Look at it dripping down and then coagulating at the bottom. That looks excellent. But we're going to go one step further because we want this to be hot and cold. So to do that, we're going to drive it with color. So let's go to NeXus. We're going to use questions to do this. We'll go to nxQuestion. I'm going to add a new question. And the question I'm going to ask is, Mike so far has been doing particle-based questions. So, you know, the age of the particle or the speed or the emitter or the radius. But I want to ask a question of this scene object. And that's a scene question or a document question. So I'm going to change the category from particle to document. And the options I've got, I can ask questions about the frame, the time. I can ask questions about whether it's in the camera's field of view. That's cool. But we're going to do object distance. And what I want to do is measure the polygons of our wolf head. So let's put our wolf in there. And what I want to say is, are the polygons less than 3 centimeters away from the particles? And if they are, do something. And the something I want to do is I want to turn the particles blue. So let's go to action, leave it as a set color, and I'll change that to, I want it to be full blue. Yeah. So now if we hit play, the particles that get within that distance, yep, look, see, they're going blue. And they're going to be our cold particles. Excellent. So now what we want to do, I'm going to just go to my wolf and take away all that friction, because we're not going to use friction in the collider tag to make them stick to the wolf. What we're going to do is simulate this kind of variable viscosity friction. And we're going to do that with some data mapping. Before we do, at the moment, we've only got white or blue particles. We want these to blend. Now, another amazing NeXus modifier is nxBlend. Let's bring one in. We'll bring this below the gravity. Now, the blend, it searches for neighboring particles and it blends their parameters over time. By default, it's set to color. That's what we want. So let's say that particles that are within, let's say 20 centimeters of each other will blend. Let's put this blend on full whack. 1,000 is full. And then let's say, so if a particle is within 20 centimeters of another, its properties will be blended and it'll keep blending for 300 frames. We don't need it to be that long. Let's just say maybe 40. So now that we're blending, this is working. Yes, look, now we're getting a blend from blue to white. And this is a really heavy operation. Every single particle is searching within 20 centimeters of itself for other particles and blending all of those properties and changing every frame. This is on the GPU, so it's lightning fast. On the CPU, this operation would be way, like order of magnitude slower. But it's working really fast for us. Excellent. So now we've got that, what we need to do is we need to do this friction. We need the blue ones to cool down. So let's go to NeXus and we're going to bring in an NX speed. And I'm going to put the speed, I've experimented with this order and I get better results with the blending happening last in our modifier stack here. So in the speed, what we want to do is we want to limit the speed so the blue particles can't move very fast and the white ones are uninhibited. So to do that, I'm going to change the operation in the speed modifier to acceleration, but I'm going to turn this exponential off. So there's no acceleration. If we hit play, nothing has changed. But the reason we've brought this in is we're going to take advantage of this clamping of the maximum speed. If we stick that on and put this value really low on 50 centimeters, every particle is having its speed clamped at 50. It can't go faster. Yeah, that's working. If we put this speed clamp up to something high, like 10,000, every particle is going to be uninhibited, actually. They're not going to have their speed slowed down because they're never reaching that fast. But what we're going to do is use data mapping so that blue particles have this really slow speed limit. In fact, we're going to make blue particles have a maximum speed of 0, so they can't move. And white particles are going to have no speed limit, well, a very high speed limit, so it effectively never affects them. So we'll do that in the mapping tab. We're going to bring in a map, and we're going to use color. Now, this might seem a bit counterintuitive. I'm going to use the red color channel here to map this speed. And you might think, why on earth are you using red? Why don't you use blue? You're using blue in the viewport. Well, the reason we're not using blue is about the way in which these colors are mixed. The blue particles have 100% blue. The white particles have 100% blue as well. They also have 100% green and red. That's what makes white. So we don't have that variation across the blue channel. However, the red channel, the white particles have maximum red, but the blue particles have 0 red. So in the red color channel, we have that range of between 0 and 1 that we need. That's why we're using red. So we're going to go to the red channel. We're going to map the maximum speed. And what this is saying is the x-axis here is our red range from 0 to 1. So the particles with no red in them are the blue ones, and the particles with full red are the white ones. So we've got blue to white across the bottom, and then we have got the speed limit on the Y. So at the top of the Y is that really high maximum speed limit. The bottom of the Y is 0 centimeters per second speed limit, so they can't move. So this is therefore saying blue particles are clamped to 0. They cannot move. And as they get whiter, the speed limit is raised until the point where they're no longer affected. So now if we hit play, what you'll see is, yes, look, our blue particles are cooling. They're going more gloopy. They're not able to move. But because of our blend, when they are hit by the hot fluid, they are melted once more and start to move again. Brilliant. So we're just about there, really. The only problem we've got is that we've got some blue stragglers that are just floating in midair. I'm not sure, you may not be able to see this on the stream, but we have some particles, look, that are just staying static. And that's because they've had their speed clamped. So what we need to do is one more trick to ensure that these don't get stuck. And we can do that with another question. And we're going to do that with some groups. So what we'll do is go to our emitter, to our groups tab. I'm going to hold Control and Alt, and I'm going to create 2 new groups. So I'm going to click this twice, 1, 2. And in the emitter, we've got to make sure that the mode is set to first group only. So what this is saying is every particle, as soon as they're born, is being put into particle group 1. Particle group 2 is doing absolutely nothing at the minute. Now we're going to go to our speed modifier. We're going to go to the groups affected, and we're going to drag in both groups, and we're going to say group 2 is not going to be affected by our speed limits. There are no particles in group 2 at the moment, so it's not doing anything. So now we're going to go to our nxQuestion, and what we need to do is go to our object. So we're going to use another object distance question. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this one, hold Control, drag it down. And what we want to do is say, if the object distance, now I'm going to set this up in a way that's not going to work at first. If the object distance is this time greater than, let's say, 11 centimeters, then I want it to move the particles into group 2. So let's go to this set color, and we want to change it from setting the color to setting the group. We want it to set to group 2. Now, this has just broken our rig. If I hit play, you'll see that we get no speed limiting anymore. It's disappeared. Why is it disappeared? Well, that's because our object distance, if it's further away from 11 centimeters, is answered as soon as the particles are born. So they're put into group 2, and they're always in group 2, and they're never being affected by the speed. So we need to add another question to qualify this, to make sure that they don't get put in straight away. There's loads of different ways of doing it. I'm just going to simply add a new question. And we've got a particle age question. I'm going to drag my object question as a child. And this is saying if the particle's age is greater than 30 frames, so it's going to take longer than a second to get down here. And then I'm going to put an and in there. So now it's only going to get put into group 2 if the particles are older than a second old and they are further away from the object than 11 centimeters. And I reckon a second's probably too much. We could probably just put 15 frames. So now we've done that, let's have a look. We should have our speed back. Yep, they're sticking. Excellent. But now when they come down here, we're no longer getting the stragglers. They're released from the speed limit and they drip down and they gloop down to the floor. Now, as the emitter comes down this way, we're going to get a nice gloop of particles going to the floor. We'll get some that cool and stick, others snap off, and that's working as we want it. And that's just a very quick, simple way of creating something that we couldn't do before with the amazing new NeXus tools, including the use of questions and actions, and also the amazing new data mapping layering system in the NeXus modifiers.
It's so cool. Variable viscosity I've always wanted. We can do lava and all sorts of effects with that sort of setup.
Yeah.
Such a cool system.
Very good. Okay, so we've pretty much come to the end. It's been really good to run through some of this new stuff with you. Thanks very much for joining us. We really can't say it enough. I really do appreciate you guys coming on and saying hi and joining in with the comments. It's difficult to get through all of the comments live. John Bosley, our guy in the chat, is looking at everything. And what I will do every time we finish these, I always go over all of the comments and make sure that we've got a good handle on what you guys are discussing, what questions are being asked, any requests. We will take it all on board. Yeah, thank you for that. So just a few housekeeping things before we finish. If you need any information about things like licensing, tech support, please go to the INSYDIUM website, and our team are there waiting to help you. All of the manuals are live via the website as well to give you all of the lowdown on all of these new tools and every new setting. And please do keep following us and chatting with us on social media. We'll be continuing, obviously, with the training, with the sneak peeks, and we'll let you know when we've got our new latest INSYDIUM live stream. We'll be announcing that on social media, so you will you'll know when that's going to happen. So that's it from us. Thanks again once more, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.